Good afternoon, everyone. Today's speaker is Alex Salazar. Alex is the principal and founder of Salazar Architects Studio based in San Francisco. And his firm works on multifamily housing, mixed-use development, community and urban design. Alex is a leader in affordable housing advocacy and has really done a great deal of pro bono work throughout the Bay Area, in San Francisco and in Oakland. Some examples include the Coalition on Homelessness and Homes Not Jails in the city in San Francisco. And he's also a founder of the tenants' rights group, Just Cause Oakland, as well as a number of other pro bono projects as far as India, I believe. Correct? Yeah. As a leader in this type of work, Alex sort of crosses many different disciplines, works at different scales of design. His passion is affordable housing, which we'll see some examples of today. He also serves on several boards of organizations, one in the East Bay, the East Bay Housing Organization, as well as the Association for Community Design, which is a national network of designers that focus on social justice and participatory practice. So today's lecture, Architecture and Social Change, can also be found in a book I mentioned earlier this quarter called Expanding Architecture, Design Activism. So please join me in welcoming Alex Salazar.
Thanks for the intro. Can you guys hear me okay? Is that, yeah? All right. Well, I really appreciate being invited by Michael. We've known each other probably 5 or 6 or 7 years now through ACD. So it's really great to be here at Davis and to kind of show you some of the work that I've been doing over the years. Most of the work you're going to see is pro bono work, some of which I did while I was working for other architects, some of which I've done on my own outside of professional practice. The title, the subtitle, I should say, talks about new urbanism, the new urban struggle for affordable housing in Oakland, California. Most of my work that I've done in the last decade has been in Oakland, and new urbanism has been I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with new urbanism. It's kind of a movement in design that has really affected the way that we build housing. And it's a little bit of a misnomer for this lecture because a lot of what I've focused on also has been having to do with urban kind of land use changes in industrial zones. And this is a huge issue now in the kind of inner city areas, not just in Oakland, but around the country. The conversion of industrial land to support housing. And a lot of that has been condo developments. So, and I'll talk about this as we go forward, but it's important to understand that these are some of the larger tracts of land. The few large tracts of land left in inner city areas are these industrial zones. To kind of touch on the India issue, I really got started in community design work right when I finished my undergraduate degree. I was lucky enough to get a Graham Foundation Fellowship to India to study affordable housing in rural areas, vernacular buildings, participatory projects by non-government organizations. So I spent a year traveling with groups who were involved in squatter settlements in rural areas. And that's where I learned about participatory housing, like hands-on workshops, working with villagers to kind of give vision to what folks were really needing in those communities. And what I learned there, a big lesson there, which is important, is that a lot of these groups that do work in developing countries are also doing community organizing. And community organizing is basically where organizations, individuals, or community members are involved in mobilizing people to put political pressure on the system, whether it's the city or the state or government entities. And so what I took away from India was that, wow, there's all this activity that's not architecture per se, but it influences urban policies. And so I started out my career understanding that, wow, there's a lot of outside of the design field that's important. So when I came back to the United States, I started to work for architects who worked for nonprofit developers. They built affordable housing because that was kind of where my interest was after coming back from India. And I've worked with a lot of them. I actually started with David Baker back when I was in school. Ended up at Bob Marquis' office. Didn't have a picture of him. Bob Herman, Mike Piatok, I was there for a long time, very well known for affordable housing and community design. And then I ended my career working for other architects at Dan Solomon's office, really to focus on urban design issues. Parallel with all of that training, professional training, before I started my practice a couple years ago, I've always been volunteering my time with nonprofit organizations in the Bay Area. And I think a lot of them were mentioned. The main one that is important for my presentation is East Bay Housing Organizations, EBHO. You'll probably hear me say EBHO quite a bit in this lecture. And EBHO is an umbrella nonprofit advocacy organization for nonprofit affordable housing developers. So there's a whole field of housing development done by nonprofit developers. And there are architects specialized who work with them, myself included. And I'm on the board of EBHO now. And a lot of the members of EBHO are nonprofit developers. There are some community-based organizations who do community organizing who are members. And there are individual professionals. They might be in government or they might be working in some kind of agency that have an interest in affordable housing. And so we are a coalition working in the urban areas of both Alameda and Contra Costa County. Through EBHO and through my connections to nonprofits in Oakland, I've done a fair amount of urban design work pro bono, most of which is pro bono. And so I'm going to talk about in this lecture basically 3 projects. I've actually done 4 of these, but I'm just going to focus on 3. The first is the Uptown project. This was kind of the largest, most complex of the 3 that I'm going to talk about. That's the one talked about in the chapter in the book project that was done recently. But since that project, there's been several others, including Wood Street and Fruitvale Gateway. And what's important to understand is I'm going to go into detail about Uptown, but many of the same processes and ways that we kind of intersected with the community are the same in these other projects. Even though EBHO, my organization, has changed the way we have operated as we get involved with community-type work for various reasons that I'll talk about as we go forward. Now, since I'm focused on Oakland, it's good to know a little bit about the city. Is anybody here from Oakland? Living in Oakland? A couple people, 2, 3, 4 people. Well, if you're not from the Bay Area, don't know much about Oakland, you probably have a lot of stereotypes about the city. Because all you hear in the press is all these sort of negative impressions, and there's some validity to it. But by and large, the city actually is very diverse. There are wealthy areas, there are poor areas, it's very complex. But the city, through its history, has always had this sort of tension around race and class issues. And what's important to understand in this map kind of demonstrates that this is Oakland. There are areas where you see in yellow and red and green that are predominantly low income, predominantly Latino, Asian, African American, and those are called the flatlands. And that is a very distinct area in Oakland. As you get into the hills, it becomes very white, more conservative, at least for the Bay Area conservative, and wealthier. And that divide in the city has played out in the politics over many years. Historically, going back, the 50s, 60s, 70s, there was quite a lot of redevelopment in Oakland. A lot of government programs, kind of demonstrated by this map at the top, says percent Negro population demonstration area, which is the downtown in West Oakland, that little circled area. Somewhere there's a pointer. So this is downtown Oakland, and this is West Oakland, which is part of downtown. And that area was targeted for redevelopment. And some of you probably know from readings from other cities or perhaps about Oakland or San Francisco that the institutions that build roads or build freeways or build BART, in this case in West Oakland, basically used the low-income areas and wiped out whole neighborhoods with that development work. So here we are, the heart of the African-American community in West Oakland, the commercial district wiped out by the BART tracks that went down the center, kind of bringing the demise to the commercial center in the African-American neighborhood. Here we are in downtown Oakland, whole city blocks razed to the ground through redevelopment projects that wiped out downtown neighborhoods that were housing low-income folks back in the day. That history has kind of generated a lot of resentment in the city, especially in the flatlands. And that has played out through the last decade. Some of you probably remember Jerry Brown was mayor of Oakland for 8 years. Just about the time that I came to the city in 97, 98, he was elected mayor on a progressive platform. As soon as he got in the office, his progressive platform kind of flipped upside down and became a little bit overly developer-friendly and actually worked to undermine the nonprofit community. And so a lot of what I'm talking about is in relation to this. The main thing that he did is he brought in what was called the 10K plan. And this was more of a promoting condo development in downtown than a real plan. But they put in the planning department put in certain regulations, bonuses, and whatnot to spur condo development. And sure enough, with Jerry Brown's connections, he was a former governor, very well-known, high-profile guy, he was able to bring a lot of capital and a lot of interest in developing condos during the boom times. And that effort was parallel, a lot of people don't know this, parallel with the whole effort to shut down a lot of the nonprofit affordable housing buildings in downtown Oakland. That he actually worked to undermine single-room occupancy hotels. So these are hotels where a lot of them run by nonprofits that provide housing for the lowest income folks, people who are homeless, who maybe a few times a month have a room in a hotel to get off the street, or it might have social services attached to it because it's a nonprofit that serves formerly homeless tenants. Well, there was a plan afoot at the time when he started out as mayor to kind of shut down all these hotels. Just one of many examples of what Jerry Brown did to try to undermine the nonprofit community. Well, because of that effort, condos and attacking the nonprofits, there was a social movement that started soon after he started in office as mayor. There was basically a resurgence of political activity among artists, among youth, among the nonprofits that I was a part of as well, to advocate that the downtown development include affordable housing, not just condos, but that they do inclusionary zoning or they set aside parcels of land for affordable housing. So I worked with EBHO and with community-based organizations to try to build coalitions to push back on the mayor, push back on the city, to kind of do what they should be doing from our perspective. And these are just some images from that experience. Very colorful, a lot of artists, a lot of artwork, a lot of tenant rights activities going on. Very dynamic time with some major things that happened that have changed Oakland's political landscape today. Well, the keynote project in the mayor's plan was what was called the Uptown Project. The idea for the mayor was to bring 10,000 new residents downtown. The Uptown, as the major project, in one project would bring, they were planning 1,000 units to start and like 2,000 units over time. And the Uptown Project, to orient you, the city center is right here. Kind of reads city center. This is Broadway, City Hall. So it's right off from City Hall. There's an area of land that was, some older buildings, some residential buildings, but mostly vacant parcels. And an organization called, for-profit developer called Forest City came in to redevelop the parcels of land into housing, mostly condos. And the architect, or one of the architects' planners was Cal Thorpe. So Cal Thorpe is a well-known new urbanist, and he basically led the urban design process for the development. So the project was controversial because of what Brown was doing, and so myself, along with others in EBHO, formed a coalition to advocate for affordable housing. So in the Uptown Project, we basically did certain things to push back on the project. And that consisted of several key things. The first thing we did is we were essentially played the role as a watchdog role, bringing our technical expertise of building affordable housing to meetings when the developers or when the city staff had to do their formal planning process. They were required to do certain public meetings. So we would show up and we would raise a lot of ruckus and demand that they include affordable housing. And we used that process to then build a coalition around the issue. And this played out over several years. What you see up on the upper right actually is outside of a community design charrette that Calthorpe was leading. So as part of the formal process, they had to do a certain number of charrettes with residents from the neighborhood. So we basically went into those charrettes and we took over the meeting. In this particular one, after we did the little protest outside, we went in and we auditorium like this, and we basically demanded that we get to present our version of what they should be doing as opposed to what Forest City was proposing. It's kind of a funny story because I ended up actually applying for a job at Calthorpe's office a couple years later. And I was talking with the staff, and they said that, well, after that meeting, Calthorpe called his staff over, and he said, that's how we used to do it back in the 60s. So like these architects who are doing these developments right now, these big, large-scale developments, have been in practice for 30 years. But they've sort of lost touch with the community. And so it's just kind of a funny comment that he would say something like that. It's kind of heartwarming in its own way for me. Another aspect of how we built a coalition around the Uptown project was to essentially build the structure for advocacy in Oakland around housing. And this was something new, that housing activism really happened, I think in the 80s, early 80s, kind of held on through the 80s, but then it sort of died out. And as part of EPHO, myself and others built what was called the Coalition for Workforce Housing. We, myself included, I helped start Just Cause Oakland, which is a nonprofit community organizing organization for tenant rights. And we published maps demonstrating, for example, this map by EPHO, reported 30-day no-cause evictions. So at the time that the housing boom started, a lot of people were being forced out of the city through just the market changing, through condo developments, property changing hands. And what it maps, you can kind of see this map of Oakland again, that the evictions that were happening during this period of time, over I think a couple years, evictions were happening in the flatlands, in the low-income, African-American, Latino, Asian communities, and very, very little evictions were happening in the hills, which were predominantly white, predominantly or more ownership housing in the hills. And so, of course, those who are most impacted by the development and being displaced are the low-income communities. So we published this, we advocated around it, we built the kind of structure for large-scale advocacy and protests. This is actually an image from the Uptown area. This was a shelter for homeless folks that was shut down. If you go there now, it's a condo development. And we organized this large protest throughout the Uptown area. We called it a gentrification tour. And we used that to kind of bring media attention to the story, and we were very successful at that. So we sort of started to pull together not just our technical expertise, but our ability to get media attention to the story. And of course, we won at the ballot box for tenant rights in Oakland as well. The other aspect of what we did as a coalition was to do our own community design work. So we brought our skills, or I brought my skills as an urban designer, architect. I roped in other architects. And we held community design charrettes, you can see in the upper right. We developed drawings and a design for fitting in affordable housing, sites A and B here. These two sites that you see in this drawing are basically a little site right here, right next to the Fox Theater, and then a little site right here. So we were basically using our skills to say, hey, this is a different vision for how you can develop this project. You can set aside certain parcels of land within the Forest City Master Plan on the right, and you can leave enough parcels so that we can develop approximately 25% of your market rate project, and you can keep it as affordable housing. And so all of these different tools that we used ended up being somewhat successful. And the story here with this particular drawing is that Site B, which is the one right next to the Fox Theater, it's right here, ended up being a parcel of land that the city actually had control of. And we knew going into this design effort that we're going to ask for 2 sites, but we planned it out. We figured that we're going to have to negotiate at some point. So we actually gave up control of Site A in exchange for them conceding and giving us Site B as an affordable housing development. And so that negotiations went forward. We were successful in those negotiations. And that project now is being built, that affordable housing development, as part of the Uptown project, is being built by Pytac Architects, my old firm, and a nonprofit developer that's based in Berkeley. And so there are lessons from this project that EBHO learned. And one of the big ones is that while we were successful as a technical organization in kind of butting our nose, into the project and getting an affordable housing development set aside, we didn't do quite a good job at building the coalition. That a lot of the tenants, a lot of the grassroots organizations who were from the neighborhoods, who were low-income folks to begin with, weren't very happy at the end of it because they felt like they didn't have enough control over the process. EBHO is more of a technical organization. We're not really a community organizing group. And so we tried to do community organizing, but it wasn't quite as smooth as it could have been. So that was one lesson. But the other positive things is that we put housing back on the table as an issue that the other organizations could build power around. And so that became, certainly in recent years, a much more important thing, which I'll get into next. And then the other thing is that we realized because we were successful in establishing this development as an affordable housing project, we had this momentum behind us. We had momentum to go into the next big projects to also have an influence over their development. So this was 2003. Since 2003, there's been other projects I've been involved with, that EBHO has been involved with, and that the community-based groups have been more of the leaders of. One of those groups is Just Cause Oakland, the tenant rights group I've mentioned. And the project that came out of this was a couple years ago, 2005, which was called the Wood Street development. Wood Street was another one of these very large master plans done by Pytac Architects this time. Condo development, 3,000 units for several developers on industrial land near what was the train station. This is the historic West Oakland Wood Street train station in Oakland that was actually home of the first African-American union in the United States. So it's symbolically important, not just in Oakland, but around the country. It's where C.L. Dellums was the founder of the Sleeping Car Porters Union. And of course, today, Ron Dellums, his nephew, is now mayor of Oakland. So the politics around West Oakland train station and the condo development became a really hot issue in 2005. Just Cause used those issues to start doing community organizing in West Oakland. It's predominantly kind of housing that you see here, small Victorian era 2-3 bedroom housing units, and a lot of industrial land. West Oakland has a lot of leftover land. The effort that we put on as a technical advisor, so my role became less leading the coalition, but more advising the coalition. That was the shift that happened in EBHO. And Just Cause took the lead. And of course, it went through a lot of the same processes: media attention, protests, taking over meetings, coming up with our own independent plan, putting that forward. All of these activities that we saw in the Uptown project translated into Wood Street, but there was this change. The change was that it's the neighborhood groups now that led the process. And what's fundamental about that is this project was more about building power in the neighborhood than building housing. And even though we were focused on affordable housing as the issue, it wasn't really about the housing issues. So in technical advisory role, we came up with ways of changing the 3,000 unit project into from condos to allow for about 25% of the units to be built as affordable housing. So we came up with a plan. This is an illustration of that plan. And then we did some urban design work. A little bit hard to read, but the site is this whole area that I'm circling here. And we were asking the developers to set aside 4 parcels, 1, 2, 3, and 4, for affordable housing. And we developed a way of doing that, of financing that with loans, with tax credits, all the different structures that nonprofits use. This is an example of one of those sites. And that effort that came out of Wood Street was successful. So much like Uptown, it reached a point of negotiations with the developers. Actually, one of the developers was Bridge Housing, although they have a for-profit arm that's called Build. It's the same entity. And the politics around it kind of played out with the election that happened when Jerry Brown left Oakland. Ron Dellums was running for mayor. Everybody knows his history with West Oakland and the train station. So this was a very symbolic development. And the grassroots organizations who were advocating for affordable housing in West Oakland also were backing his campaign. So there was this direct kind of lineage of political pressure during the mayoral race. And I think because of that, the developers eventually gave up 2 sites within the master plan as affordable housing developments, and those are now being in the process of being done. So it was another example of how this kind of advocacy work carries out. More recently, once I started my own practice in 2007, there was another project that came up. Basically, the same nonprofit community organizing groups became focused on what was called the Fruitvale Gateway Project. This is the original kind of master plan by the developers. It was approximately a 3,000 unit, or sorry, I think it was it was about an 810 unit housing development, condos. And this is in the Fruitvale district. So for those of you who have traveled on BART, there's the BART tracks. Fruitvale Station is at the end over here. And this was a whole zone of industrial land that this developer controlled that they wanted to convert to condos. And so they hired an architect who's not very skilled at affordable at housing. And the architect proposed a whole series of mostly high-rise buildings along the tracks. Sounded like a good idea, extremely expensive. The market's not really there to support that. This is a very low-income Latino neighborhood. But with the housing boom, condo developers had a lot of illusions about what the market could support. So they came up with this plan. But when I got invited by the coalition to start to look at the plan and to analyze it, it was clear to me that it was not sustainable. Here we are again in the plan. You can see the housing blocks in red. These are parallel to the track. It's a little hard to read, but there's a north arrow here. So south is off down here. So in the afternoon light, these housing towers would essentially block light down onto the street. It would block light in the development itself. So these would be very shaded, not very pleasant condo development. Really overscaled, overmassed, and just didn't make any sense for housing. But 810 units is also not very many units for this parcel. So I started to work with the coalition. We went through the usual advocacy work, media protests, developing a master plan that was from the community, that advocated around different issues. And we essentially looked at the site, and here we are, a little bit better representation of the plan. You can see BART over on this side. You can see the BART tracks on East 12th Street. A little bit of context here. This is Fruitvale, the kind of commercial core of Fruitvale. This is one of the larger schools in the Fruitvale district. And the development was right across the street from the school. So the neighborhood and the low-income residents who were part of the coalition and were leading the coalition had certain issues that they wanted represented. So one thing, was the urban design context was to turn the buildings more east-west so that light in the afternoon could come down into those courtyards, into those spaces, and provide more, reduce the shadows, basically. But from the community's perspective, there were larger issues than that as well. Here we are with the kind of master plan that we came up with. Here you see the housing tower, or not towers, but buildings oriented more in an east-west direction so that light in the afternoon could get into the courtyards. But there were certain key elements in this plan. We wanted to preserve parcel A, as affordable housing, so that the 810 units would have at least 25% affordable housing in the development. The community was very concerned about jobs because this is industrial land. There's, the best paying jobs are jobs working in light industry. So preserving part of the site as light industry or light industrial was important. Having ample open space and nonprofit services and children's and kids' facilities that would relate to that space was important for after-school activities. It was right across the street from a school, so we were trying to integrate that into the development. And then we left a lot of the parcel, about maybe 60% of the land, for condo development. And what we realized in doing this is that we could still get the 810 units that the developer wanted, but instead of in 16-story towers, we dropped it down to 5-story buildings. Still getting the same number of units, plus keeping jobs, plus having open space, all these things that the community wanted. So that became a key issue and a way for us to advocate around the project. This was all at the same time that the market was basically slowing down, which has now collapsed. So the project actually has, I think, no longer is moving forward. But we were successful. And so we kind of, the way I looked at this, and I think the big lesson for me out of this project was that while we advocate, as someone who does a lot of affordable housing, for very low-income housing, often in the neighborhoods, it's not really the housing issues that are perhaps the key issue. They're concerned about jobs. They're concerned about the environmental impacts of the development. And so I think as an architect concerned with these issues, I think one thing I've learned over the years is basically to kind of step back from my preconceptions and really listen to what the community has to say, and to try to work as a community designer to kind of integrate that into how we advocate for affordable housing. And so to kind of wrap up, to talk a little bit, this slide is more, I think, for me, it more talks about the 15 years that I've been doing this kind of work, starting out in India. And the way I kind of look at it, and maybe this is a little bit of a gross exaggeration, but there's kind of working inside the formal system of housing. You have folks like Calthorpe or like Piatok or older firms who go through the normal planning process. Any development, you're required by the planning department to go through some kind of public process. And so you can work through that as an architect and try to hear what the community says and integrate that into what you do. And some people call that community design. It is, to a certain extent. 99% of the work that gets done out there is this kind of work, whether it's in India, whether it's in the United States. And you can use certain tools, community design tools, modeling kits, workshops, to get input into what you do. But the point of the formal system really is, you're trying to get the project done. It's goal-driven, and you get the project done, you move on to the next thing. It's not about building power. Very different way of looking at community design. Whereas the other way to look at it is you're outside the formal system. And this is where when I get the opportunity to do that kind of work, is the way I like to work, which is you're working directly for the local groups, you're working hands-on workshops, and it's not about getting a project done per se, but it's about using housing as a tool to get people involved, to build coalitions so that you can put political pressure on development issues, and then put forward what the community is really concerned about by using, housing is essentially the hook. And so as an architect, urban designer, I think that's, and for me, kind of one way of looking at it. And I think, when I look back at the work that I've done on these 3 or 4 projects in Oakland, the question is, have we been successful? And I think, it kind of depends on how you look at it. Some of you are landscape architects. I'm an architect. For me, it's like, has the profession been responsive to what's happened in the urban areas? And, I think it's a mixed bag. I think that there's been a lot of failures, I think, in the architectural profession. And this kind of work that community designers are doing around the country is kind of trying to change that. There's certainly been a lot of change in the ideas around architecture recently that are now trying to incorporate community design issues and advocacy issues. And so that's a good shift that's happening. But over the years, there really has been a neglect to the field. And that's not just the fault of any one particular person, but the whole industry has sort of become so focused on the formal planning process and building firms that do great work, but over time, those firms have sort of become detached from the communities. Case in point, Piatak Architects, Callithorpe, Solomon, Baker, these are all firms that do affordable housing. But as they've grown, as they've matured as firms, as they've become more well-known, known for design, they've also have a distance to the community. They're no longer really part of the grassroots, even though they may have started there back in the 60s. So on that level, we've failed as a profession. On the flip side, I think for the coalition, for the grassroots groups, for EBHO, I think we have been successful to a certain degree. I think as technical professionals who have been, like myself, who have been involved in these coalitions, I think we've realized that we shouldn't be leading those coalitions. We should be helping those community-based groups advocate better from a public policy point of view, from a development point of view, and helping them build the skills to lead these coalition efforts. And I think, over the last decade, we've been successful in shaping that model in Oakland, where things now are a lot less controversial than when I started out on this work. And so I think there has been a lot of success, but it's always a fight. Some more images. Skip through this. So to kind of wrap up a little bit, the slide, I actually put this lecture back during the campaign. I put the slide together during the campaign. So it is, to me, a lot like what happened at a national level. I mean, I think the national level kind of change that we've seen happen in the administration in a way reflects what's actually happening on the ground. That there has been this whole new generation of activists, and certainly in Oakland and other major cities around the country, where a new generation of activists, of leaders, of community leaders have started. And they're running organizations, they're doing community organizing, and they're making a difference in their neighborhoods. And that change, that sense of optimism, that sense of pushing back, I think in a way has bled into the political campaign at a national level. And I don't think Obama really would have won without a lot of these activities over the last decade happening all around the country. Because I think just a lot more people are aware. Certainly college students obviously had a major impact. And so I think, that's a very distinct way of thinking about what we do, as opposed to the kind of Clintons, not to play politics here, but who are the older generation, right? They're the architects that started 30 years ago. They're the politicians who started 30 years ago who have become a little bit distant and a little detached. So for me, in my practice, in what I hope to continue to focus on and be involved with is this more grassroots work. It's kind of been my experience, and I think as students, as you finish your degree, go out into the profession, assuming that it's still around, you should just not lose that passion, I think, that you perhaps have if you got involved in the Obama campaign, if you care about certain political issues or certain neighborhood issues. The lesson is just get involved, stay involved. When you develop as a professional, I think you can carry that feeling or that impetus to kind of create change into the practice that you end up having. And just don't lose sight of that. I think that's really important. And it's what I've tried to do. And Thanks a lot for having me here. I'll take... I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, we have about 2 minutes for questions. Ask Alex.
Yeah.
As far as design charrettes, trying to get those started in small communities, what are some resources on how to go about that?
Yeah, depending on where you're located, there's different design centers, the community design centers, I'm sure Michael has kind of told people about. There are certain organizations nationally like ACD, Association for Community Design. There's a database of groups that do this kind of work. You can also look for nonprofits that do housing planning work, either as nonprofit developers or as planners. The nonprofit community generally is plugged into these kinds of campaigns. So I don't know where you're from, but wherever you're interested in, there's probably a group doing something similar. Maybe not as political as what I've been doing, but there are always groups that do this kind of design work. I'd start with that. Yeah.
Just to add, I did put a couple of links on the course website from my UC Davis. And one is the Association for Community Design. When you go to that website, you can query by state, and it lists a whole bunch of organizations, community design centers that are doing this work. And there are a number in the Bay Area, Northern California as well.
Yeah.
A lot of the projects you showed were in response to the good times, the economic growth.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what you kind of see in the future in terms of community design during this next period. It's going to be a little different.
Yeah. Everybody's trying to figure out where to go from here. EBHO, the organization I'm on the board of now, has a lot of developers on it. And what's happened at the state level is funding has just disappeared, essentially, for affordable housing development. So on the one hand, it's even more important for the advocacy role right now, because we've got to find a way to bring capital back into the affordable housing market, because it's suffering just like the condo market. I think going forward, if the state can, and foundations that's the other side of it, foundations who fund this kind of work, either the community-based groups or EBHO, also have suffered because of the collapse of the economy. And so funding is drying up from just grants. And so everybody's kind of, I think there's, in some ways, groups are trying to consolidate their efforts. There's probably going to be a lot of mergers between organizations to get through. Everybody's hopeful, I think, that the condo market's probably not going to come back in maybe 10 years, but the advocacy work, I think, if the banking system get a little bit more repaired, then I think we'll see money still flowing into the nonprofit sector. But it's going to be lean. I think the next 5 years is going to be extremely hard, and a lot of groups may not survive or may just have to merge to get through. So, but on the flip side, it's even more important. So I think there's probably going to be a lot of more interest as well, and probably more volunteer efforts or labor efforts to get involved, because the affordable housing issues are just even more important right now.
It might be interesting to look at, you talked about the sort of generational shift, right? This group that started in the 60s and that over time, through success, professionalized, et cetera. There have been several sort of swings in the economy since then. It seems that in previous times, where the economy's been bad, community designers have really become more entrepreneurial and focus more on economic issues. So that might be a trend we see again.
Yeah.
I had a question that I want to come back to this tension that I heard in talking about sort of different generations. Perhaps it's kind of the paradox of success.
Yeah.
Right. And you mentioned many of the individuals and firms that you've worked with before learned a lot of great skills that in general do good work, but have in a sense lost the sort of the connection with building power. And can you talk a little? I mean, there's a tension and paradox with that. At the same time, there's this sort of tension and paradox with, as community designers, as designers in general, we want to improve community environments, right? And if we're so successful those communities then, in a sense, attract capital, attract investment, developers, and then leads to gentrification processes.
Right.
So there's something here about there's paradoxes both professionally as well as in the environments we're trying to create.
Right.
And do you have any thoughts about it?
It's complex. I mean, I know I kind of set this up as a sort of duality, but it's a little more blurred, I think, than that. And I think one thing that's important. I know I mentioned Piatak quite a bit. I worked for him for a long time. I'm actually working with him right now on a large development. We need to make change in neighborhoods or make change in cities. You need people in every position of power. I mean, you need people who are working for the private market developers who understand the issues. You need people on the ground who are just activists, neighborhood activists. And I think, maybe I'm talking around what you've raised, but I know during these campaigns, I've always had folks on the inside working for the developers who I've been able to call and get information on. And that's always helped lead or guide us in actually having an impact. So I think there is a tension, you're kind of a victim of your own success. If you're a firm, for example, it's always sexier and sexier to get the bigger projects, and mixed income developments are, what big firms are trying to get right now, and that's where it's most lucrative. And I don't know, I think where for an individual firm, an architecture firm or planning firm, I think you really have to be cognizant of not losing that connection to the grassroots. And I think certain firms are trying to do that by putting capital towards community-based work, so that it's basically cross-subsidizing the work as a for-profit way of doing it. It's I don't know. It is complex. And I think in neighborhoods too, there's it's not like the neighborhood is all one entity. There are different voices within those neighborhoods. Some people are for the condo developments, and they see there's too much affordable housing in their neighborhood. So it becomes there's the generational impact on those discussions, but I think part of it, there's a debate about what's appropriate development or not, how much affordable housing to put in or not. And I think where I'm coming down, my perspective as part of EBHO, it's certainly not universal, is we kind of need all the players together. And if we're not going to get anything if we start infighting, that the folks who are really pro-development we need to find some middle ground, and not lose sight that we're not just displace people without any way of mitigating that displacement. We need development, go ahead and do it, but there should be some safeguards as well. And so I think I don't know if I completely answered your question, but I think everyone's kind of coming to that realization. But it all plays out in politics. Sometimes you lose. Other questions?
Great. Well,
All right.
thank you again.
Thanks a lot. Sorry.